refused to follow. And for that, Secretary Esper was fired by the President. So, Mr. President, I am very concerned that Mr. Hegseth lacks the consistency and the moral clarity to lead the most combat-credible military in the world. And I am very disappointed that this body would put a nominee on the floor without the due process of advise and consent that the position of the Secretary of Defense deserves. Our men and women in uniform deserve better. And therefore, for the first time since I was elected to represent the people of New Hampshire in the United States Senate, I plan to vote against this nominee for Secretary of Defense. Thank you. I yield the floor.
The senator from Rhode Island is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. President. First, I want to commend Senator Shaheen for a typically thoughtful and compelling speech concerning the proposed nomination of Mr. Hegseth to be Secretary of Defense. I will follow by rising to express my opposition to Mr. Pete Hegseth's nomination to be Secretary of Defense. Mr. Hegseth is the 9th Defense Secretary nominee that I have considered as a member of the Armed Services Committee. I have voted in favor of all of his predecessors, including those from the first Trump administration. While some former secretaries and I have disagreed politically, there was always an understanding that partisanship has no place when it comes to providing for our men and women in uniform. Indeed, the weight of this position, Secretary of Defense, is enormous. The Secretary is responsible for leading a department of 3.5 million service members and civilians, an annual budget of nearly $900 billion, and hundreds of thousands of aircraft, ships, submarines, combat vehicles, satellites, and our nuclear arsenal. They also play a powerful role with allies, partners, and adversaries abroad, having to meet, communicate, and coordinate with a whole range of individuals from many different ethnic groups, many different religious groups. That's part of the role of Secretary of Defense. At a bare minimum, former Secretaries of Defense have had the experience, wisdom, and character to do that job. Mr. Hegseth, however, is simply not qualified to meet the overwhelming demands to be Secretary of Defense. Last week, the Armed Services Committee held a nomination hearing for Mr. Hegseth. During the hearing, my colleagues and I raised a number of concerning reports about him. A variety of sources, including his own writings, implicate him with disregarding the laws of war, financial mismanagement, racist and sexist remarks about men and women in uniform, alcohol abuse, sexual assault, sexual harassment, and other troubling issues. Instead of addressing these reports, many of which are documented and on the record, he dodged and deferred. He did not attempt to alleviate the fears that my colleagues and I have that there is material and a pattern of abuse in his personal history that could be used by adversaries to try to influence him, to try to deflect him from his sworn obligations and duties to the United States, and frankly, to embarrass him as Secretary of Defense. These reports are unlike anything we have seen for a nominee of this importance, and if they are confirmed, they would undermine his ability to be an effective leader. As I have said for months, it is critical that the FBI and the Trump transition team carry out an exhaustive background investigation on Mr. Hegseth. In that regard, I must say that I am extremely disappointed by the investigation process. Before Mr. Hegseth's hearing, I was briefed by a transition team on the findings of the background check. I was alarmed that investigators had neglected to contact critical witnesses and whistleblowers, and I urged them to reopen the investigation. During my experience on the Armed Services Committee, it is unprecedented that the FBI has returned to my office 2 more times, as recently as last night, to provide additional information on the nominee. Frankly, I still do not believe the background investigation is complete. Last week, after the hearing, I was made aware that an individual with disturbing information about Mr. Hegseth has been interviewed by the FBI in December as part of the background investigation. However, their testimony was not adequately included in the briefing provided by the Trump transition team. As such, I asked this individual to recount to me directly the testimony that she had provided to the FBI. I was disturbed by what I received. Earlier this week, the Armed Services Committee received a sworn affidavit from Pete Hegseth's former sister-in-law that alleges specific incidents of Mr. Hegseth's alcohol abuse, threatening and abusive behavior toward his second wife, and a repeated pattern of offensive public misconduct. The affidavit was signed and sworn under penalty of perjury, and it has been made available to all senators to review, and I hope that you do. I will share a few examples from her sworn testimony, which she gave to FBI investigators. Once, while drunk in uniform, which is a violation of military law, Mr. Hegseth was so inebriated that his brother had to carry him out of a Minneapolis strip club. This occurred during a drill weekend with the Minnesota National Guard. The FBI was also told that Mr. Hegseth's second wife had an escape plan that involved texting a safe word to her friends and family to urgently request help without putting herself in more danger. This escape plan was executed on at least one occasion. On at least one occasion, his second wife hid in her closet out of fear. And in many detailed examples, the FBI was told that Mr. Hegseth regularly became so drunk that he passed out, vomited, and had to be carried out of family events and public settings, sometimes shouting sexually and racist offensive comments. My point is this. We know that Pete Hegseth's former sister-in-law testified to the FBI about his history of abuse, alcoholism, and disgraceful public behavior. However, we know now that her testimony was not adequately included in the Trump transitions team background briefing to the Senate. This begs the question, what else is missing from the FBI report? The Senate is not considering a low-level appointee right now. We are advising and consenting on the nominee for Secretary of Defense, and we cannot risk installing a leader who may have a history that is exploitable by our adversaries. Nor can we risk confirming a Secretary of Defense who has shown that he is incapable of being responsible, accountable, and law-abiding 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, as that job requires. In addition to Mr. Hegseth's troubling personal conduct, I also have grave concerns about actions he would take as Secretary of Defense. During his nomination hearing, I asked Mr. Hegseth about disturbing efforts underway within the Department of Defense to intimidate military personnel and their families, and reports that the Trump administration may implement a so-called purge board to screen senior military officers for, quote, unfitness to lead. This raises the chilling possibility that the Trump administration may fire officers who are deemed to have the wrong political views. I believe that the Tuesday firing of the U.S. Coast Guard Commandant Admiral Linda Fagan, who by all objective accounts was an admirable leader, proves that the purge is underway. Unfortunately, Mr. Hegseth would not categorically condemn those efforts during his hearing, and instead talked about meritocracy and restoring accountability within the senior ranks of the military. If the Senate confirms Mr. Hegseth this week, who will be fired at the Department of Defense next week? And I doubt very seriously it will be based upon merit or anything else other than a political agenda. And that would be the beginning of the unraveling of the core element of our military. It is not political. It serves neither party nor person. It protects and defends the Constitution of the United States. And if we lose that, we will have lost something that is, I think, the key to our success, not only as a military force, but as a nation. Despite Mr. Hegseth's comment, the United States military is already one of the finest meritocracies in the world. Every member of the military is in their position because of their ability. They are chosen by boards of other senior officers who evaluate their performance, who look closely at what they've done, and render their best professional opinion of the capability of that person to move on and assume a particular job. Every member of the military is in their position because of their ability. When there's always a possibility that you need to count on the person next to you to save your life, there is no other choice but meritocracy and value. There's no other choice that you must or can make other than to pick someone whose focus, whose heart, whose spirit is to protect their fellow soldiers, sailors, Marines, airmen, spacemen, not to exploit them. To make a judgment about their colleagues, not based on their political affiliations, but on the fact that they are a co-soldier, sailor, airman. And I see a dangerous, dangerous point at which we will divert from this historic and compelling approach and become a political organization. We've seen it happen in other places around the world, where militaries are undermined and subjected by political leaders that have a particular political point of view and passion, and they become essentially not an army, but an extension of the political aspirations of the great leader. We can't see that here in America. Our present service members can and should be confident that with hard work and skill and character, they will be successful in their military careers. That's the key criteria. Indeed, this very meritocracy would prevent a person like Mr. Hegseth from rising higher in the ranks of the military. The totality of his own writings and conduct would disqualify any service member from holding any leadership position in the military, much less being confirmed as a Secretary of Defense. If there was evidence that a serving officer in the military was drunk in uniform in a strip club, if there was evidence that a senior military officer was engaged in sexual relations while married to another woman, having just fostered a child from another woman, I can guarantee you that officer's career would end swiftly, either by resignation or by court-martial. Moreover, our service members, since the birth of this country 249 years ago, have taken an oath to the Constitution. Their mission is to protect the country and all of its citizens and the ideals this country was founded on, which should endure no matter who is president or what political party is in power. Mr. Hegseth's idea of meritocracy, however, seems to be that service members should pledge fealty to a president who will be in power for only 4 years and fit the ideas of a party that only half of this nation supports. There is no faster way to undermine the lethality and morale of our nation's military and the support of the nation's citizens for it than to inject politics into the system. Mr. Hegseth, if confirmed, will not improve our military, but destabilize it and weaken the institution. Further, during his hearing, Mr. Hegseth failed to convince me and many of my colleagues that he is capable of running any organization remotely as complex as the Department of Defense. Mr. Hegseth has been the head of 2 separate veterans organizations. From 2008 through 2010, he led the organization Veterans for Freedom, which had an annual budget of less than $10 million. Each year he was in charge, outlays exceeded revenues until the organization verged on bankruptcy and had to be merged with another group. From 2011 until 2016, Mr. Hegseth ran the organization Concerned Veterans for America. During each of those 5 years, tax records show that the organization spent more than it raised. If this is how Mr. Hegseth manages organizations with a comparatively small staff and budget, how can anyone have confidence that he will be able to effectively manage an organization with hundreds of multi-million and billion-dollar contracts that literally drive the economy of many parts of this country? If confirmed, Mr. Hegseth would be the leader of millions of men and women of every race, religion, and political belief. He can only be an effective leader of an effective fighting force if he has respect for those he leads and they trust he supports them. Unfortunately, Mr. Hegseth has shown disdain and outright hostility for many he would lead. His writings and speeches make clear his opposition to diversity initiatives. He has said, diversity is not our strength, unity is. On a recent podcast, he said, I'm straight up just saying we should not have women in combat now roles. Mr. Hegseth has also written, the other side, the left, is not our friend. We are not esteemed colleagues, nor mere political opponents. We are foes. Either we win or they win. We agree on nothing else. That is not the spirit to bring to lead the men and women of our military forces. When I joined the Army as a young officer in the 1970s, the U.S. military was rife with racial tension. Women were prohibited from serving in most roles. Gay service members were banned, and we relied on a national draft to fill our ranks. The soldiers I served with were proud to do so, but it was certainly not the nation's most capable military by any standard. We have made great progress since then. Today, the Department of Defense is fully integrated. Every race and religion is accepted. Women serve in all combat roles and leadership positions. Sexual orientation is irrelevant to service, and the all-volunteer force visibly reflects the nation it protects. Our military is more diverse than it has ever been, but more importantly, it is more lethal than it has ever been. This is not a coincidence. This diversity and nonpartisanship is the bedrock of our military power, but Mr. Hegseth seeks to destroy that. One of the strengths of the U.S. military, which has made us respected around the world, is the adherence to the rule of law and clear standards on the battlefield to protect civilians and treat prisoners with humanity. Once again, this nominee for Secretary of Defense, if confirmed, will put that principle in doubt. Mr. Hegseth has championed the pardoning of military members who were turned in by their fellow soldiers and SEALs, as well as military contractors convicted of killing 14 Iraqi civilians without cause. He has advocated for the reinstitution of interrogation methods like waterboarding, that have been defined as torture and has belittled the advice and counsel of the Judge Advocates General while on deployment. In his book, The War on Warriors, he wrote, quote, "Should we follow the Geneva Conventions? If our warriors are forced to follow rules arbitrarily and asked to sacrifice more lives so that international tribunals feel better about themselves, aren't we just better off in winning our wars according to our own rules? How can our military personnel trust each other and the partners and allies we need in this dangerous world trust the United States if such rules and conventions are tossed aside? What a bounty this would give our adversaries. And how would we have the moral authority to criticize the North Vietnamese, for example, who tortured pilots like our colleague John McCain, if our Secretary of Defense is saying waterboarding is perfectly fine? We wouldn't. In fact, I think our pilots would be very much concerned if they felt there are no rules of the game. And if they went down behind enemy lines, they would be just brutalized, tortured, etc. And we don't even have a moral objection to it. Finally, my top priority as a United States Senator has always been national security. And my colleagues, I hope, know this. I do not seek partisan wins or the political spotlight. I want to do right by men and women in uniform, and I refuse to compromise or cut corners on national security issues. The greatest privilege I have had in my life is to lead soldiers, to understand and respect them, to do my best by example and leadership so that they would have confidence that their best interest was my sole interest. That's not what I heard from Mr. Hegseth, and that's not what he's going to bring to the Department of Defense. Process is important for a nomination of this sort. Other than me, Mr. Hegseth refused to meet with any of my Democratic colleagues on the committee. An unprecedented act, a signal that he is not trying to be a nonpartisan secretary. He is, in fact, going to be very partisan. Again, injecting politics into the Department of Defense, which is, in my view, fatal. The committee was denied a second round of questioning with Mr. Hegseth, although we needed that time. And I should point out, historically, when Secretary Hagel was here, we had 3 rounds of questioning. When Secretary Carter was here, we had 2 rounds of questioning. So the precedent was strongly in favor of an additional round. So we've essentially been denied the kind of access that would have revealed more of Mr. Hegseth's qualities, conduct, and thoughts. And that's not appropriate. And as I said previously, the FBI background check was inadequate. Again, the first time I've ever had a background check supplemented by 2 additional addendums to the background check. That's not the way I've experienced business. So I would hope my colleagues are a bit alarmed, that are asking themselves, does this individual have the character and the competence and the composure to be Secretary of Defense? I frankly am not convinced, and stunned in many respects, the lack of scrutiny which too many of my colleagues are using to consider this nomination. The lives of thousands and thousands of men and women in uniform, the security of our nation, and indeed the world is at stake. I hope we will all take time to reflect on whether we are ready to confirm Mr. Hegseth to be Secretary of Defense. I will personally urge my colleagues to vote against the nominee. And with that, Mr. President, I yield the floor.
Senator from Mississippi is
In a
recognized.
few moments, the Senate will vote on a confirmation of our next CIA director, and then immediately following, there'll be a vote on cloture on the nomination of Mr. Peter Brian Hegseth, President Donald Trump's nominee for Secretary of Defense. I'm going to vote yes for cloture, and I expect that a majority of our senators will do so. 3 months ago, 77 million Americans voted for change in the United States, and they sent President Trump back to the White House. It was a decisive victory and a clear mandate to focus this nation on prosperity and peace. That work begins at the Pentagon, where we must return to a policy of peace through strength. We're facing the most complex and dangerous global security environment since World War II. The next few years will shape the direction for the remainder of the 21st century. It could be led by the United States, a future which would lead to freedom and prosperity for all Americans in the absence of armed conflict. Or it could be led by despots. The Chinese Communist Party is working against us. Its dictator, Xi Jinping, uses military force and economic coercion to try to reshape the world order with the help of his junior partner, Kim Jong-un of North Korea. At the same time, the despot Vladimir Putin remains intent on territorial expansion. Iran, Hamas, Hezbollah, the Houthis, and their like continue to attack Israel and the United States, and ISIS remains set on killing Americans every day. Unfortunately, the Biden administration wasted precious time and significant resources pursuing divisive social policies at DOD. For instance, we just spent months arguing with the administration over whether the Defense Department should pay for hormone therapies or puberty blockers for minors out of taxpayer dollars. 71% of Americans oppose that policy, including more than half of Democrats. So I'm glad we're going to abandon that type of policy. I could go on, but let me now turn to focusing on the future. Together, Congress and the President have a lot to do, and we don't have much time to do it. We have a broken shipbuilding industrial base to fix. We have defense manufacturing jobs to build up and munitions lines to expand. We have an ossified budgeting system to update, and we've got an audit to finish for the first time in decades. And we have a resourcing problem that needs attention. On his way out the door, Secretary Austin now tells us we need to spend a lot more on national security. Well, thank you, Secretary Austin. It is an admission 4 years too late, Mr. President. We're simply falling behind our adversaries in too many ways. So President Trump seeks to reverse this trend and bring much needed change to the Pentagon. And he's chosen a man to lead the Pentagon. His choice to spearhead these efforts is Pete Hegseth, a retired major and combat veteran in the Army National Guard. Admittedly, this nomination is unconventional. The nominee himself is unconventional, just like that New York developer who rode down the escalator in 2015 to announce his candidacy for president. That may be what makes Mr. Hegseth a good choice. He's not beholden to the status quo, and he's open to new ideas. He's intent on lethality and readiness, and shouldn't we all be? His experience in the line of fire and his service member advocacy make at least one thing clear. Pete Hegseth will put the men and women of our military first. Congress has often seen defense secretaries delay and evade congressional oversight. I think Pete Hegseth will be willing and eager to partner with us in that regard. Last week, the Senate Armed Services Committee convened to consider Mr. Hegseth's nomination. In testimony lasting nearly 4 hours, he addressed 3 key audiences: our committee, the United States Senate as a whole, and the American people. I think the American people liked what they saw. I know I did. He showed each of us why President Trump chose him to be the next Secretary of Defense. First of all, he articulated a clear vision of the Pentagon. I think it's clear to anyone who listened that he's going to bring energy and fresh ideas to shake up the department's stagnant bureaucracy. He will restore a warfighting ethos and relentlessly focus on the military's core mission to deter conflict and, if necessary, to win a war. Mr. Hegseth committed to bringing a swift end to the corrosive social policies that serve to divide our service members rather than unite them. And as I pointed out earlier, the American people are behind him in this regard overwhelmingly. He correctly stated that we need to change the way the Pentagon does business. He will restore a culture of accountability by cutting red tape, incentivizing innovation, and rebuilding the defense industrial base. He affirmed his intent to tackle the hardest systemic problems that plague the Pentagon, challenges that previous secretaries have proven unable to fix. And I mentioned that audit. I sincerely believe we'll get an audit done under his oversight. And importantly, he agreed that maintaining the inadequate Biden-era defense budget levels would be dangerous to our national security. And we hear, as I said, the outgoing secretary admitting that very thing. In his testimony before our committee, Mr. Hegseth said this: "My only special interest is the warfighter, deterring wars, and have called upon winning wars by ensuring our warriors never enter a fair fight. We let them win, and then we bring them home." Unquote. Well put, Major Hegseth. I'm confident Mr. Hegseth, supported by a team of experienced top officials, will do exactly that. Pete and his family have endured numerous smears and false news stories. Less reported is the outpouring of support this nominee has received. Pete Hegseth has devoted his career to fighting for his fellow soldiers, and his fellow soldiers, men and women, are now speaking out in his behalf. In the past few months, a host of flag officers signed an open letter enthusiastically commending Mr. Hegseth. I thank these generals and admirals for doing so. The Armed Services Committee has received letters from female soldiers who support Pete. We received messages from those who served alongside him on the battlefield, including a moving statement from a Medal of Honor recipient who backs Pete Hegseth to the hilt. These men and women uniformly vouch for Pete Hegseth's leadership, tenacity, and passion for supporting the warfighter. On the day of his hearing, 100 Navy SEALs marched from the Vietnam Veterans Memorial to the Senate office buildings. They marched together that distance, and rows of Mr. Hegseth's fellow soldiers sat behind him in solidarity for the entire 4-hour-long hearing. These patriotic Americans were willing to step forward and declare their support for Mr. Hegseth publicly. In stark contrast, I might add, to the anonymous attacks we've heard about. Mr. President, in this critical moment for our national security, I believe we have the right man for the job. I urge my colleagues to continue in their support of Mr. Hegseth's nomination to be our next Secretary of Defense. Thank you, Mr. President. Absence of a quorum.
The clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Also Brooks.
Mississippi is recognized.
I suggest that the quorum call be vitiated. By
Without
unanimous
objection.
consent.
Is there a sufficient second? There appears to be. The clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Also Brooks, Ms. Baldwin, Mr. Banks, Mr. Barrasso, Mr. Bennett, Mrs. Blackburn, Mr. Blumenthal, Ms. Blunt Rochester, Mr. Booker, Mr. Bozeman, Mrs. Britt, Mr. Budd, Ms. Cantwell, Mrs. Capito, Mr. Cassidy, Ms. Collins, Mr. Coons, Mr. Cornyn, Ms. Cortez Masto, Mr. Cotton, Mr. Kramer, Mr. Crapo, Mr. Cruz, Mr. Curtis, Mr. Daines, Ms. Duckworth, Mr. Durbin, Ms. Ernst, Mr. Fetterman, Mrs. Fisher, Mr. Gallego, Mrs. Gillibrand, Mr. Graham, Mr. Grassley, Mr. Haggerty. Ms. Hassan. Mr. Hawley. Mr. Heinrich. Mr. Hickenlooper. Ms. Arono. Mr. Hoven. Mr. Husted. Mrs. Hyde-Smith. Mr. Johnson. Mr. Justice. Mr. Kane. Mr. Kelly. Mr. Kennedy. Mr. Kim. Mr. King. Ms. Klobuchar. Mr. Langford. Mr. Lee. Mr. Lujan. Ms. Lummis. Mr. Markey, Mr. Marshall, Mr. McConnell, Mr. McCormick, Mr. Merkley, Mrs. Moody, Mr. Moran, Mr. Moreno, Mr. Mullen, Ms. Murkowski, Mr. Murphy, Mrs. Murray, Mr. Ossoff, Mr. Padilla, Mr. Paul, Mr. Peters, Mr. Reed, Mr. Ricketts, Mr. Resch, Ms. Rosen, Mr. Rounds, Mr. Sanders, Mr. Schatz, Mr. Schiff, Mr. Schmidt, Mr. Schumer, Mr. Scott of Florida, Mr. Scott of South Carolina, Mrs. Shaheen, Mr. Sheehy, Ms. Slotkin, Ms. Smith, Mr. Sullivan, Mr. Thune, Mr. Tillis, Mr. Tuberville, Mr. Van Hollen, Mr. Warner, Mr. Warnock, Ms. Warren, Mr. Welch, Mr. Whitehouse, Mr. Wicker, Mr. Wyden, Mr. Young. Senators voting in the affirmative: Also Brooks, Banks, Blackburn, Britt, Cornyn, Kramer, Gallego, Gillibrand, Haggerty, Hyde-Smith, Johnson, Justice, Moreno, Paul, Rosen, Schmidt, Scott of Florida, Tillis, Wicker, Young. Senators voting in the negative: Duckworth, Heinrich, Sanders, Van Hollen. Mr. Reed, no. Ms. Ernst, aye. Mr. Warner, aye. Mr. Moran, aye. Mr. Crapo, aye. Mr. Coons, aye. Mr. Peters, aye. Mr. Blumenthal, no. Mr. Lujan, no. Mrs. Capito, aye. Mr. Tuberville, aye. Mr. Grassley, aye. Mr. King, Mr. King. Aye. Mr. Graham, aye. Mr. McConnell, aye. Mrs. Fisher, aye. Mr. Rounds, aye. Mr. Curtis, aye. Mr. Murphy, no. Mr. Langford, aye. Mr. McCormick, aye. Mr. Barrasso, aye. Mr. Daines, aye. Ms. Slotkin, aye. Mr. Ossoff, no. Mr. Cassidy, aye. Ms. Murkowski, aye. Mr. Markey, no. Mr. Budd, aye. Ms. Collins, aye. Mr. Durbin, aye. Mr. Sheehy, aye. Ms. Cortez Masto, no. Mr. Ricketts, aye. Mrs. Moody, aye. Mr. Cruz, aye. Ms. Lummis, aye. Mr. Risch, aye. Mrs. Murray, no. Ms. Hassan, aye. Mr. Cotton, aye. Mr. Husted, aye. Mr. Schumer, no. Mr. Sullivan, aye. Mr. Merkley, no. Ms. Baldwin, no. Mr. Padilla, no. Mr. Hoven, aye. Mr. Lee, aye. Mr. Marshall, aye. Mr. Schiff, no. Ms. Warren, no. Ms. Blunt Rochester, no. Mr. Wyden, no. Mr. Kane, aye. Mr. Kim, aye. Ms. Hirono, no. Mr. Whitehouse, aye. Mr. Bozeman, aye. Mr. Booker, aye. Mr. Schatz, no. Mr. Mullen, aye. Mr. Welch, aye. Ms. Smith, no. Mr. Thune, aye. Mr. Hickenlooper, aye. Mr. Bennett, aye. Ms. Cantwell, no. Mr. Kelly, aye. Mrs. Shaheen, aye. Mr. Warnock. Mr. Warnock, no. Mr. Scott of South Carolina, aye. Ms. Klobuchar, aye. Mr. Hawley, Mr. Hawley, aye. Mr. Kennedy, aye.
So the yeas are 74, the nays are 25. The nomination is confirmed. Now recognize the majority leader.
Thank you. I ask unanimous consent that with respect to the Ratcliffe nomination, the motion to reconsider be considered made and laid upon the table, and the President be immediately notified of the Senate's action.
Is there objection? Without objection.
Mr. President. Mr. President.
The Democrat leader.
Mr. President, if there was one word that should never, ever describe a Secretary of Defense, it is erratic. But that is the one word that describes Mr. Hegseth best. Advancing a Secretary of Defense is one of the most important votes senators are going to take all year. This man has lives in his hand, lives of citizens, lives of people of the world, and lives of the brave men and women in our armed forces. So I want my colleagues to think carefully of all the people we could have as Secretary of Defense. Is Pete Hegseth really the best one we've got? Come on, you know he isn't. You know he's not even close. Is this the best man we have to lead the greatest military in the world? Is this man, with a known history of excessive drinking, the guy you want at the other end of the phone at 2 a.m. in a crisis? In control of the nuclear codes? Who are we kidding? Who are we kidding? Is this the man with a mile-long list of allegations of abusing, degrading, and harassing women who you want to be leading our men and women in battle? Is this the man with a track record of erratic behavior, the best you think the members of our military deserve as a leader? Is this the man with a truly horrific and devastating lack of judgment, the best you think our country, our fighting men and women deserve? Pete Hegseth has proven to lack the necessary morality, sense, judgment. So I plead with some of my Republican colleagues just to answer me this. Do you think this is the best person for the job? Do you think this is the best person we have to lead the best military in the world? I yield the floor.
Will report the motion to invoke closure.
Cloture motion. We, the undersigned senators, in accordance with the provisions of Rule 22 of the Standing Rules of the Senate, do hereby move to bring to a close debate on the nomination of Peter Hegseth of Tennessee to be Secretary of Defense, signed by 17 senators.
Pursuant to Rule 22, the chair now directs the clerk to call the roll to ascertain the presence of a quorum.
Ms. Alsobrooks, Ms. Baldwin, Mr. Banks, Mr. Barrasso, Mr. Bennett, Mrs. Blackburn, Mr. Blumenthal, Ms. Blunt-Rochester, Mr. Booker, Mr. Bozeman, Mrs. Britt, Mr. Budd, Ms. Cantwell, Mrs. Capito, Mr. Cassidy, Ms. Collins, Mr. Coons, Mr. Cornyn, Ms. Cortez Masto, Mr. Cotton, Mr. Kramer, Mr. Crapo, Mr. Cruz, Mr. Curtis, Mr. Daines, Ms. Duckworth, Mr. Durbin, Ms. Ernst, Mr. Fetterman, Mrs. Fisher, Mr. Gallego, Mrs. Gillibrand, Mr. Graham, Mr. Grassley, Mr. Haggerty, Ms. Hassan, Mr. Hawley, Mr. Heinrich, Mr. Hickenlooper, Ms. Hirono, Mr. Hoven, Mr. Husted, Mrs. Hyde-Smith, Mr. Johnson, Mr. Justice, Mr. Kane, Mr. Kelly, Mr. Kennedy, Mr. Kim, Mr. King, Ms. Klobuchar, Mr. Lankford, Mr. Lee, Mr. Lujan, Ms. Lummis, Mr. Markey, Mr. Marshall, Mr. McConnell, Mr. McCormick, Mr. Merkley, Mrs. Moody, Mr. Moran, Mr. Moreno, Mr. Mullen, Ms. Murkowski, Mr. Murphy, Mrs. Murray, Mr. Ossoff, Mr. Padilla, Mr. Paul, Mr. Peters, Mr. Reed, Mr. Ricketts, Mr. Risch, Ms. Rosen, Mr. Rounds, Mr. Sanders, Mr. Schatz, Mr. Schiff, Mr. Schmidt, Mr. Schumer, Mr. Scott of Florida, Mr. Scott of South Carolina, Mrs. Shaheen, Mr. Sheehy, Ms. Slotkin, Ms. Smith, Mr. Sullivan, Mr. Thune, Mr. Tillis, Mr. Tuberville, Mr. Van Hollen, Mr. Warner, Mr. Warnock, Ms. Warren, Mr. Welch, Mr. Whitehouse, Mr. Wicker, Mr. Wyden. Mr. Young.
A quorum is present. The question is it the sense of the Senate that debate on the nomination of Peter Hegseth of Tennessee to be the Secretary of Defense shall be brought to a close? The yeas and nays are mandatory under the rule. The clerk will now call the roll.
Ms. Also Brooks. Ms. Baldwin. Mr. Banks. Mr. Barrasso. Yes. Mr. Bennett. Mrs. Blackburn.
Thanks, yes.
No, I didn't. Warren. Mr. Blumenthal.
That's why I voted a key. I seal.
James, yes, too, I think, didn't you? Yeah.
I did. Ms. Blunt Rochester. Mr. Booker. I did. You were no.
Or shall I? Good.
You're an aye. Mr. Bozeman. Mrs. Britt. Mr. Budd, Ms. Cantwell. I got you.
Lomasai.
Thank you. Mrs. Capito. Mr. Cassidy. Thank you. Thanks. Ms. Collins. Mr. Coons. Mr. Cornyn. Ms. Cortez Masto. Mr. Cotton, Mr. Kramer. Mr. Cruz, Mr. Curtis, Mr. Daines, Ms. Duckworth. Mr. Durbin. Ms. Ernst. Mr. Fetterman. Mrs. Fisher, Mr. Gallego, Mrs. Gillibrand. Mr. Graham. Mr. Grassley. Mr. Haggerty. Ms. Hassan. Mr. Hawley. Mr. Heinrich. Mr. Hickenlooper. Ms. Hirono. Mr. Hoven. Mr. Husted. Mrs. Hyde-Smith.
Aye.
Mr. Johnson. Mr. Justice. Mr. Kane. Mr. Kelly. Okay, thanks. Mr. Kennedy, Mr. Kim, Mr. King, Ms. Klobuchar, Mr. Langford, Mr. Lee, Mr. Lujan, Ms. Lummis, Mr. Markey, Mr. Marshall, Mr. McConnell, Mr. McCormick, Mr. Merkley, Mr. Moody, Mrs. Moody, sorry, Mr. Moran, Mr. Moreno,
Aye.
Mr. Mullen, Ms. Murkowski, Mr. Murphy, Mrs. Murray, Mr. Ossoff, Mr. Padilla, I got him. Mr. Paul, Mr. Peters, Mr. Reed, Mr. Ricketts, Mr. Risch, Ms. Rosen, Mr. Rounds, Mr. Sanders, Mr. Schatz, Mr. Schiff, Mr. Schmidt, Mr. Schumer, Mr. Scott of Florida, Mr. Scott of South Carolina, Mrs. Shaheen,
Gotta get used to this thumbs up thing. Kind of hurts.
Mr. Sheehy, Ms. Slotkin, Ms. Smith, Mr. Sullivan, Mr. Thune, Mr. Tillis, Mr. Tuberville, Mr. Van Hollen, Mr. Warner, Mr. Warnock, Ms. Warren, Mr. Welch, Mr. Whitehouse, Mr. Wicker, Mr. Wyden, Mr. Young, Senators voting in the affirmative: Banks, Barrasso, Budd, Capito, Cornyn, Cotton, Crapo, Cruz, Curtis, Daines, Fisher, Graham, Grassley, Hawley, Hoven, Husted, Hyde-Smith, Johnson, Justice, Kennedy, Lankford, Lee, Lummis, Marshall, McCormick, Moody, Moreno, Mullen, Paul, Ricketts, Risch, Rounds, Scott of Florida, Scott of South Carolina, Sheehy, Sullivan, Thune, Tillis, Tuberville, and Wicker. Mr. Cassidy, aye. Senators voting in the negative: Baldwin, Bennett, Blunt Rochester, Booker, Cantwell, Collins, Coons, Fetterman, Gallego, Hassan, Hickenlooper, Kane, Kim, King, Klobuchar, Lujan, Murray, Ossoff, Peters, Reed, Sanders, Schumer, Shaheen, Slotkin, Smith, Warnock, Warren, Welch, Whitehouse, and Wyden. Mr. Merkley, no. Mr. McConnell, aye. Ms. Murkowski, no. Ms. Rosen? No. Mrs. Blackburn? Aye. Mr. Padilla? No. Mr. Heinrich? No.
I think we'll probably close this one. We need like 7.
Mr. Van Hollen?
10 minutes. So
No. Ms. Also Brooks? No.
or sorry, 3:10. Is that right?
Mr. Schiff? No. Ms. Cortez Masto? No. Mrs. Britt? Aye. Mr. Schmidt? Aye. Ms. Ernst? Ms. Ernst? Aye. Mr. Warner? No. Ms. Hirono? No. Ms. Duckworth, no. Mr. Markey? No. Mr. Schatz? No. Mr. Young, aye. Mr. Murphy? No. Mr. Haggerty, aye. Mr. Bozeman, aye. Mrs. Gillibrand? No. Mr. Kelly, no. Mr. Durbin, no. Mr. Moran. Aye. Mr. Blumenthal. No. Mr. Kramer. Aye.
On this vote, the yeas are 51, the nays are 49. The motion passes. Nomination.
Department of Defense, Peter Hegseth of Tennessee to be Secretary.
You want me to? The senator from Tennessee is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. President. I rise today to urge my colleagues to support the confirmation of my constituent and friend, Pete Hegseth. Last week, during his 4.5-hour confirmation hearing, America saw exactly why President Trump nominated Pete Hegseth to be our next Secretary of Defense. Pete is patriotic, Smart, he's an energetic leader. His priority is our warfighters and having their backs by focusing the Department of Defense on lethality and competence rather than extraneous political and social issues. He's the type of leader that can inspire, recruit, and retain the absolute best talent America has to offer. Despite Pete's qualifications, the mainstream media, desperate to derail President Trump and his nominees, has gone after Pete's character by airing false and unsubstantiated claims. Take, for example, the article published Tuesday, just this week, by the New York Times. Despite the salacious and misleading headline in this paper, buried beneath 13 paragraphs of slanderous allegations, the Times actually disclaims the entire story with a direct quote from the supposed victim herself, denying the allegations against Pete, saying, quote, "There was no physical abuse in my marriage." Yet look at this headline. Hegseth, ex-in-law, claims he was abusive to second wife, even though in the same article, the second wife disclaims all of this. This isn't journalism. Take a moment to think about this. This is a hit job. The New York Times intentionally ran with a salacious and debunked account, buried the truth, and distorted the lead simply to undermine President Trump and his nominee. The New York Times is not alone. Unfortunately, NBC News, The Hill, Politico, and even the Associated Press all chose to run this same salacious, false headline instead of the facts. Unfortunately, I'm not surprised. This is the type of misleading and often unequivocally false reporting that we've learned to expect from the left-leaning media. The American people remember that the New York Times is the same publication that denied and suppressed the Hunter Biden laptop story leading up to the 2020 election. It's the same paper that endorsed Joe Biden in 2020, the same paper that endorsed Kamala Harris in 2024. You know, the American people are sick and tired of the deception stemming from this alliance between the Democrat Party and the so-called mainstream media. This is yet another example of a story published with an aim to do harm, and despite evidence to the contrary. It's why media has lost much of its credibility with the American people, who see this article for what it is, a desperate, last-minute attempt to generate controversy where none exists. Pete Hegseth is someone who's going to fix the Pentagon and deliver on President Trump's vision of peace through strength. He's exactly the type of leader that the Pentagon needs in the face of an increasingly complex and escalating security situation that's occurring around the world. So while I'm disappointed, I'm not surprised at this 11th hour attempt by the media to raise debunked and completely discredited falsehoods simply with an aim to derail a confirmation. I urge my colleagues to see through this noise, evaluate Pete's nomination based on the merits, which is why I plan to vote for Mr. Hegseth. I yield the floor and suggest the absence of a quorum. Oh, I'm sorry.
Will the senator withhold his request?
Yes, move to vitiate the quorum.
The senator from Alabama is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. President. I want to reiterate what my colleague from Tennessee just talked about, the importance of the vote that we just took just a few minutes ago. Our nominee for new Secretary of Defense, Pete Hegseth. Now, the procedure is, as we just voted, to close the vote, and now we wait 30 hours from just a few minutes ago and have the final vote on his nomination, which it looks like that he has the votes of a majority to be appointed or sent to the White House to be confirmed as the next Secretary of Defense. I'm on the Armed Services Committee. and I've watched 4 years of the destruction of the best military in our world, the United States of America. It is a shame what has happened. The DEI, the woke agenda that's being pushed on the troops in our country, to me is embarrassing. I'm a military brat. My dad died on active duty in the military, awarded 5 Bronze Stars and a Purple Heart at age 17, driving a tank across Europe after landing the first day at Normandy. We have to change course in our military. And we can talk about inflation and pumping gas and the crime and all the things that we're having a lot of problems with. But if you don't have a strong military to protect our borders and protect the citizens in our country from adversaries all over the world, we got problems. And it's got to start there. Pete Hegseth is the choice, the right choice. I like his age. I like his demeanor. I like the things he brings to our military. He's exciting, and he will energize this military into the next decade. And I'm excited about that. So hopefully in about 30 hours, we'll vote tomorrow night around 9 o'clock, and we'll vote to confirm Pete Hegseth is our new Secretary of Defense. Now, I'd like to turn to national security threats in our nation's agriculture sector and food supply chains. I'm on the Ag Committee. Over the past few years, the United States has experienced a rapid increase in foreign investment in the agriculture sector, particularly from China. We have to open our eyes. Bad things are happening around us. Growing foreign investment in agriculture and other essential industries like healthcare and energy is a direct threat to our country's national security. You know, for years now, I've been sounding the alarm about foreign ownership of American farmland and other elements of our food chain. According to the USDA data from December 2023, foreign investors own approximately 45 million acres of U.S. agricultural land. Now, let me say that again. 45 million acres of our forest and agriculture land in this country has been sold to foreign entities. Does that not scare us? What do we just see during COVID about our drug supply? We looked around, we looked for health care and help after COVID hit our borders, and what happened? We found out that it was all being made in China. So, 45 million acres, this represents over 1.5 million acres in one calendar year. Foreign ownership of U.S. agricultural land increased modestly from 2012 to 17, an average increase of 0.6 million acres per year. That's 2012 to 2017. But since 2017, the number has skyrocketed to an average of 2.6 million acres a year that we're selling our farmland to our adversaries. And it's just not China. It's Russia. It's other entities that don't wish us well at the end of the day. So additionally, between 2010 and 21, entities or individuals from China increased their ownership of U.S. agriculture land more than 20-fold, from about 14,000 acres to 400,000 acres. This is an unbelievable and unsustainable pace for the United States of America. Now, Alabama is experiencing, my state, this firsthand. We have the 4th largest amount of foreign-owned agricultural land in the United States at 2.2 million acres, most of which is forest land. It's not really agriculture in terms of growing row crops. It's basically our forest. You know, I represent over 62,000 farmers in the state of Alabama. I hear from them time and time again about foreign activity in our agriculture community. Threats like these are something our states can't handle all on their own, which is why President Ford established the Committee on Foreign Investments in the United States, also known in short terms, CFIUS. This was in 1975. In other words, this committee is supposed to keep an eye on foreign investments in our country. This is the governmental body that oversees the vetting process of foreign investments and acquisition of American companies in the interest of national security. CFIUS is composed of 9 members of President's Cabinet, including the Secretary of State, Treasurer, Defense, Homeland Security, Commerce, and Energy, the Attorney General, the U.S. Trade Representative, and the Director of Office of Science and Technology Policy also sit on this vetting board of industry and land in our country. Nowhere on that list did you hear me say the Secretary of Agriculture. Now, why is that? Chinese investors and companies own 277,000 acres of agriculture land in the United States. Considering the massive increase in foreign investment in our country, we need additional oversight for what's going on in our country. We got our eyes closed, which is why yesterday I introduced the Foreign Adversary Risk Management Act, called the FARM Act, here on the floor, that will accomplish 3 major things. First, it would add the Secretary of Agriculture as a permanent member of CFIUS. In other words, that somebody that's going to help our agriculture people vet land that's being bought by foreign entities. Second, it would protect the U.S. agriculture industry from foreign control through transactions, mergers, and acquisitions and agreements, or it would also designate agriculture supply chains as critical infrastructure and critical technologies. Third, it would require a report to Congress on current and potential foreign investments in the U.S. agriculture industry. This legislation, folks, is long overdue. These foreign investments now reach into every aspect of agriculture industry and supply chains, from farming and processing to packaging and shipping. We cannot, and I repeat, we cannot allow our adversaries to have a foot in the door to our critical supply chains. Food security is national security. We must prioritize increased oversight of foreign investment in our food supply chains, especially those coming from China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea. This starts with giving the agriculture community a permanent seat at the table of CFIUS. The FARM Act does just that, and there's no better person to fill this permanent seat on CFIUS than my good friend who we had a hearing today as the new nominee for Secretary of Agriculture, Brooke Rollins. I've known Brooke for 30 years. I met her while I was coaching at Texas A&M. She was the student body president in 1994. The students saw then that President Trump, what they see in her today, her strong leadership and her conviction of agriculture. It will be no different when she becomes the Secretary of Agriculture for the United States of America. Brooke was brought up in a small agriculture community of Glen Rose, Texas. She comes from several generations of American farmers. She participated in levels of 4-H and FFA. She raised livestock throughout her life. Now she is the mother. She's involved in the show steer industry with her 4 children. She received her Bachelor of Science degree in Agriculture and Development from A&M and later earned a law degree at the University of Texas. Later at the Texas Public Policy Foundation, she was engaged with rural and agriculture communities throughout Texas. She led litigation efforts that focused on the defense of Texas landowners and farmers against federal interference and regulations. Next, Brooke went on to serve in several roles in President Trump's White House. She served as the Director of Domestic Policy Council, Assistant to the President for Strategic Initiatives, and Director of the Office of American Innovation. In these roles, she helped roll back terrible EPA rules like Waters of the U.S., or WOTUS, that targeted farmers and ranchers. After the White House, she joined the American First Policy Institute, where she focused on protecting U.S. farmland and foreign entities seeking to gain control, especially from the Chinese. The AFPI, she strove to improve American food security, independence, as well as support measures that defend U.S. agriculture trade. Brooke understands these many challenges. In short, Brooke is a conservative warrior and will be an excellent ag secretary. I look forward to working with her to secure our farmland from foreign entities and working with her on passing a farm bill that puts American producers first again. As Alabama's voice on the Senate Ag Committee, I will continue fighting to secure our agricultural supply chain so our agriculture community can continue to put food on the table. And that starts with someone like Brooke Rollins as our Secretary of Agriculture. She is a terrific nominee, and I look forward to working with her on the committee. I expect her to move easily through the committee vote and here on this floor. So once she's out of committee, the Senate must vote on her for confirmation. She'll do great. She's perfect for the job, and I ask that the Senate take up both efforts quickly to defend our agriculture communities, which feeds not only the American people, but the entire world. I yield the floor.
President.
The senator from Tennessee.
Thank you, Mr. President. I concur with the remarks of my colleague from Alabama. We're looking forward to confirming Pete Hegseth. We're looking forward to working every single day until we get this cabinet completed. And Brooke Rollins over at Agriculture, we know that she is going to do a stellar job, and I do commend the senator for his Farm Act. I've joined him in co-sponsorship on that bill to protect our nation's farmers and our farmland owners and producers. This has been an exciting week. On Monday, we started with the inaugural of President Trump, and I will tell you, for so many of us in Tennessee and indeed across the country, this has been a reason to absolutely rejoice. It's so interesting to me, Mr. President, so many people say they survived the Biden-Harris administration. Isn't that an interesting way to think about it? The inflation, the border, all the issues, it was like survival to get through those 4 years. And because of this, the American people have really given the Trump administration and those of us in Congress a mandate. I refer to it as a to-do list, because at the Blackburn household, when there's something that has to be addressed, Chuck and I put it on a to-do list, meaning you don't stop until you get it done. Well, the good thing is, one of the top things is the southern border and securing that, and indeed we know President Trump has taken executive action to address this. He cut off that CBP One app and ended these migrant flights from other countries. He's ended catch and release. He restored the successful Remain in Mexico program, and importantly, he is designating the cartels as foreign terrorist organizations. Now, there are other things that he is doing. We all know that ICE is conducting raids and doing deportations, and we know that Congress is going to have to work with the Trump administration to make certain that these executive actions that he's taking, that we pass laws so that this is in federal statute. Now, one of those is the CLEAR Act, which is legislation I've had for years, and it ensures that state and local law enforcement officials can help the federal government with deporting these criminal illegal aliens. And by the way, that legislation requires ICE to reimburse those local law enforcement agencies. And of course, my Container Act, which again has been here for a while, it would empower the border communities, those communities that are right there on that border, farmers, ranchers, communities that those crossing illegally are running through their property. It would allow them to place barriers on federal land in order to protect their communities. And my Preventing Violence Against Women by Illegal Aliens Act, it would require illegals convicted of sexual offenses or domestic violence to be deported. These are individuals that have absolutely no business being in this country. And of course, we're going to have to do more than secure our border, and that means doing mass deportations. And here is the reason why. Under former President Biden, more than 10 million illegal aliens came into this country. Now, those are the ones we know about. On top of this, you have a classification that is called the gotaways. The gotaways are those that the Border Patrol could see on the camera, but they could not get to them to apprehend them. We know that in this number, you've got tens of thousands of criminal illegal aliens. These are not people that are coming for a better way of life. These are people that have committed crimes in their home countries and are looking to come here. Now, we know this open border has caused far too many tragedies to begin to count. And this is the reason that this body voted in a bipartisan manner for the Laken Riley Act, and that is going to be one of the very first bills that President Trump signs into law. And because of the American public's overwhelming support for a secure border, for an end to illegal immigration, we are on our way to making this country, making our communities safe again. Now, we all know that border security is a critical part of national security. Indeed, that southern border is where national security and our foreign affairs actually meet, because that border is being overrun by people from about 150 different countries every single year. Now, we also know that when it comes to national security and how the world views us, that President Trump is showing that strong leadership that is needed, and he was able to secure the release of 2 Americans that were held by the Taliban within hours of taking office. I think that the American people are realizing that President Trump means business when it comes to our foreign policy and putting the interest of the American people in front of everything else. Another issue that we're focused on for the American people is getting the cost of living back under control. We all know that for the 4 years of the Biden administration, we saw record inflation, we saw reckless spending, and Tennesseans and indeed our citizens all across the country are still reeling from inflation. You know, Mr. President, to me, it is just so interesting. When people talk about the rate of inflation, they know it's not 2.9%, which the Biden administration was touting as they left office. If you go back and look at where prices were in January of 2021, when Joe Biden took office and inflation was at 1.4%, and then you look at what has happened month by month, the true rate of inflation and price escalation, that true rate of inflation is north of 20%. Indeed, I looked up what it is costing Tennessee families, and Mr. President, the numbers were astounding, because if you look at a basket of goods and services that a Tennessee family would buy in January 2021, so if they took that basket of goods and services, bought that same basket of goods and services, today their cost would be $1,060 more for the exact same basket of goods and services. Think about that, $1,060 per month. Now, maybe that's a house payment or the equivalent of a car payment. That is a lot of money. And this is why Americans are saying we want life to be affordable again. And it is why President Trump has already signed executive orders to roll back regulations. And it's why he is moving forward with DOGE, the Department of Government Efficiency, which will bring forward ideas of how we root out waste, fraud, and abuse in the federal government. And it's why he has frozen federal hiring and done that hiring freeze, which is so essential to being able to cap what the federal employment roles are and get going on doging all of these agencies. Well, to support these efforts, I filed a series of bills called the DOGE Acts. And, you know, Mr. President, these are not things that are new. These are bills that I have been pushing for a long time because it is important that we hold government accountable for how they're spending the taxpayer money. And President Trump is pushing forward with these concepts. Another area where we are going to see attention in order to get the cost of living down is extending President Trump's tax cuts to ensure that the American people are going to have more money in their pocket at the end of the month. You know, Mr. President, there's a gentleman in Tennessee that I ran into one day earlier in the Biden administration, and I asked how he was doing. And he said, well, he had been fussing a little bit. What he was fussing about was the high price at the pump and the high price at the grocery store. And he said, you know, under President Trump, I had some money left at the end of the month. And under Joe Biden, I've got too much month left at the end of my money. People are tired of being broke. They are tired of it. So they're ready to move forward. Another area where they're wanting to see some action, and they're so pleased with the steps President Trump has taken, and that is protecting young women in sports. And it's amazing to me how the left has abandoned our high school and college female athletes. You know, we have over 3 million young women who participate in sports every single day. They're competing. Mr. President, you've got 2 beautiful daughters. They are competitive athletes. These girls work hard, and they deserve to be able to compete and win. But it is as if the Biden-Harris administration waged a war on these incredible young female athletes by destroying fair play and forcing them to compete against biological men. And the results are tragic. Young women who often dedicate their entire lives to becoming so proficient and skilled at a sport, they're missing out on scholarships, on career opportunities, and on hard-earned records that they deserve to hold. This harm, abuse, and unfairness is coming to an end. And on Monday, President Trump signed an executive order that requires the federal government to recognize the biological reality of 2 sexes, male and female. And last week, I reintroduced legislation that helps to stand up for women and girls in sports. Now, there are 2 resolutions. One is calling on the NCAA to protect women in sports. They need to rescind their rule that allows biological men to compete against women in NCAA sports. And then the other is to take October 10th of each and every year and designate this as American Girls in Sports Day and celebrate the accomplishments of our female athletes. I also have the Fair Play for Girls Act. It will require the U.S. Attorney General to submit an analysis of violence against women in athletics, to submit that to Congress, as well as for policy recommendations to support these young women. Well, as you can see, the to-do list is long, and I've barely scratched the surface. The American people are looking forward to Republicans delivering on the mandate that they have issued, and they certainly are looking forward to what will be the golden age of America. Mr. President, I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
The senator from Rhode Island is recognized.
Mr. President, I rise now for the 296th time to direct our attention to what is coming at us through fossil fuel emissions causing our natural systems to be significantly disturbed. We are not yet all the way through the first week of the second Trump administration, and already Trump has made his priorities clear. Looters and polluters reign, and their feeding frenzy comes at the expense of the American people. I expect the looting and polluting has only just begun. So we've made a new chart that will surely see the Senate floor again. When President Trump needed cash for his campaign, he knew just who to ask. He convened big oil CEOs at Mar-a-Lago. He requested that they pony up $1 billion for his campaign. And he promised them he'd immediately reverse dozens of President Biden's environmental rules and policies and stop new ones from being enacted. Giving him $1 billion, he said, would be a deal because of the taxation and regulation they would avoid thanks to him. Well, he's right about that being a super deal for polluters. The industry benefits from more than $700 billion a year in subsidy in the United States alone. $1 billion to Trump to protect $700 billion to the industry. Pretty good return on investment for fossil fuel. Well, Trump won. And the billionaires who funded President Trump's campaign want their payback. Payback began this week with a big score for the looters and polluters. On his first day, President Trump signed executive orders to lay the groundwork for weakening vehicle emission standards, raising costs for families, an average of $6,000 to $8,000, while also harming public health from the added emissions and weakening our American automobile industry's global competitiveness. A major gift to big oil at the expense of regular Americans and consumers. To review EPA's 2009 finding that the greenhouse gases are a danger, even though that finding has been upheld by the Supreme Court. The winners, the polluters driving climate change. Dramatically reduce or eliminate the social cost of carbon to protect the fossil fuel free to pollute business model. Make subsidized fossil fuel winners over domestic clean energy losers. Do you remember when Republicans used to say government shouldn't pick winners and losers? Until it's the fossil fuel industry. Withdrew from the Paris Climate Agreement, helping fossil fuel undermine global efforts to to reduce their greenhouse gas pollution. Stopping offshore wind development, clean energy competition to his fossil fuel funders at the expense of American consumers, workers, and our own domestic manufacturing base. Rhode Island, by the way, is home to the nation's first offshore wind farm and a growing number of good union jobs in the industry. Would President Trump say to the country that on his first day in office it was time to repay his big oil donors? Well, that wouldn't have gone over well. So he had to pretend that all these donor handouts would benefit the public. His first day executive order on energy begins by stating, "America's blessed with an abundance of energy and natural resources that have historically powered our nation's economic prosperity. In recent years, burdensome and ideologically motivated regulations have impeded the development of these resources, limited the generation of reliable and affordable electricity, reduced job creation, and inflicted high energy costs upon our citizens. These high energy costs devastate American consumers by driving up the cost of transportation, heating, utilities, farming, and manufacturing while weakening our national security." Virtually none of that is true. So let's look at the claims one by one. First, yeah, he got this right. America is indeed blessed with energy abundance. Where it's particularly abundant is in wind power. We have the third greatest offshore wind power potential of any country in the world. We have the fourth greatest onshore wind potential anywhere in the world. Indeed, wind resources in the Great Plains states alone could supply the U.S. with 16 times our electricity demand. That's energy abundance. Then, as this map from our